The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart Hospital hum their 3 a.m. song, a frequency that lives in Katie Rodriguez's bones after 6 months of night shifts. She moves through the ICU corridors like a ghost who learned to be invisible, head down, eyes on the monitor strip in her hands, shoulders curved inward in a posture perfected over years of not wanting to be noticed. The antiseptic smell of the hallway masks something underneath, something copper and old, the kind of smell that doesn't wash out of scrubs no matter how many cycles they run through the hospital laundry. Room for 47 waits at the end of the south corridor. Katie pushes through the door and her breath catches. Just for a moment. Just enough that she has to grip the forestand to steady herself. The man in the bed stares at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare she knows better than her own reflection. James Holbrook. Senior Chief Petty Officer James Holbrook. Baghdad, 2007. The voice on the other end of the satellite phone when Miguel went silent. The man who wrote the letter folded twice and kept in her wallet for 4 years. She doesn't let her hand shake. She reaches for his vitals chart instead, the BP cuff, the oxygen saturation monitor, the pulse oximeter that clips onto his index finger like a small mechanical creature taking his measure. His hands are pale, thin, the hands of a man who hasn't moved them in a long time. She adjusts the foredrip without speaking. There's a unit patch in his belongings, just visible inside the collar of his jacket draped over the visitor's chair. The insignia. She knows that insignia. She wore the same one on her uniform, worn soft from years of hands gripping it, from promotions that meant blood on her boots and names she stopped saying aloud. The monitors beep their steady rhythm. 78 beats per minute. O2 sat 97. BP 118/73. Stable. Everything normal for a man who shouldn't be breathing at all. She finishes the checks and moves to leave, but Holbrook's eyes shift. They focus on her face for the first time since she entered the room. Recognition flickers there, just for an instant, and then it's gone, replaced by the flat nothing that has occupied his eyes since the IED took his leg somewhere between Ramadi and the green zone. Katie is gone before he can speak. Before she can speak. Before the tremor she feels building in her chest makes it all the way to her voice. The break room smells like old coffee and someone's forgotten lunch decaying in the back of the refrigerator. Katie sits in the plastic chair by the window, the one that faces out toward the parking lot and the pre-dawn darkness that won't break for another 3 hours. Her hands are steady as she pulls the letter from her scrub pocket. The envelope is so worn now that the creases have become tears, and the paper inside is soft as cloth from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. She reads it the same way she's read it 847 times before, a mouth moving slightly, eyes going soft at the corners, hands holding the paper like it might disintegrate if she breathed too hard on it. The letter is dated March 14, 2008. Holbrook wrote it 12 days after Miguel's funeral. She knows because she has the funeral program memorized too. Open casket. Full military honors. Rifles firing over Arlington, and her in the third row trying not to break the composure that had kept her alive through 7 years of combat and 3 Purple Hearts. The night nurse named Janet enters the break room and Katie slides the letter back into her pocket in one motion, the kind of motion born from practice, from knowing exactly how long it takes to move a document from visibility to hiding. Rough night? Janet asks, pouring coffee that's been sitting on the burner since 11 p.m. They're all rough, Katie says. It's the kind of response that says nothing and closes conversations. Janet nods and drinks her terrible coffee and neither woman speaks again. The hospital shifts at 6:19 a.m. The day shift staff arrives like a changing of guards, and with them comes Dr. Marcus Sterling. He moves through the corridors with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing every administrator in the building owes him something. His white coat is perfectly pressed. His shoes are Italian leather, $1,200 a pair, the kind of shoes that click on tile in a way that announces arrival before bodies do. He's 47 years old and has been chief of surgery at Sacred Heart for 6 years, which means he's untouchable in the way that men with political backing and a network of favors are always untouchable. Katie is checking the medication lines for room for 43 when Sterling's morning round sweep past like a small entourage. There's the resident trailing behind him, the med student, the pharmacist who always looks exhausted, and the intern fresh enough that she still flinches when Sterling snaps his fingers. He doesn't acknowledge Katie. He looks past her the way you look past furniture. Patient in 443, Sterling says to the resident, not to the nurse who's been with this patient all night. What's his status? The resident fumbles with the chart. Katie has already documented everything. 3 pages of observations, medication responses, the subtle changes in respiration that mean the patient's pneumonia is responding to the aggressive antibiotic protocol. The resident will read her words and present them as his own analysis, and Sterling will nod as though the resident had actually stood here at 2 a.m. watching the patient's oxygen saturation climb from 89 to 94% over 4 hours. Vitals are stable, the resident says. BP up. O2 improving. Sterling glances at the monitor without looking at Katie. Good nursing care, clearly, he says, and it's not a compliment. It's a dismissal. It's the kind of comment that acknowledges the thing you do while making absolutely clear that the person doing it is invisible. Katie continues documenting. Her handwriting is precise. Each letter forms sharp edges. The pen doesn't shake. The rounds move on. Room for 44. Room for 45. Sterling's shadow trails him, and Katie can hear his voice carrying down the hallway, crisp, authoritative, the voice of a man who has never been questioned successfully. He'll make 47 rounds before noon. He'll give 47 orders. He'll never once know the name of the night shift nurse who's been managing complications he'll never see because they happen at 3 a.m. when the hospital belongs to the nurses. Rounds reach room for 47. Katie pretends to check supplies in the medication cart positioned outside Holbrook's room, but she's positioned so she can see into the space. Sterling enters. The entourage follows. Holbrook's eyes track them with the same 1,000-yard stare that greets everyone now. Paralyzed vet, Sterling says to the resident. Spinal cord injury. What's the prognosis? The resident doesn't know. Katie knows. Complete transection, TR5, no motor function below the waist, some sensation remaining, psychiatric complications mounting. The chart says he hasn't spoken in 34 days, which Katie has been counting, because that's the kind of thing you count when you understand what silence means. Silence is a choice sometimes. Sometimes it's the only choice that makes sense. Waiting on neurology consult, the resident says finally. Sterling nods and turns to leave. Holbrook's head shifts slightly, toward Sterling, then toward the doorway where Katie is not quite visible behind the cart. She keeps her eyes on the medication bottles. Metoprolol. Atorvastatin. Omeprazole. Small problems. Manageable problems. Not the problem of a man who used to command 14 soldiers through the deadliest summer in 3 years of war, now unable to command his own legs. The day shift arrives fully now. Katie finishes her documentation at 7:44 a.m. She's been awake for 37 hours and 14 minutes, a number she didn't plan to calculate but did anyway. Before she leaves, she walks past room for 47 one more time. Holbrook's eyes are open. They find her face. This time, something crosses them. Not recognition exactly. Something closer to knowing. But knowing what, Katie can't say. The parking lot at 7:02 a.m. is already heating up. August in Raleigh feels like breathing through wet cloth. She reaches her car, a 2007 Civic that runs perfectly because she maintains it with military precision, and adjusts the rearview mirror. The dog tags hanging there catch the light. Hers on one chain. Miguel's on another. Both of them cold, both of them real, both of them the only things she owns that still feel like proof of who she used to be. She doesn't know yet that Holbrook saw her. She doesn't know yet that his eyes recognized something in her movements, in the way she held the 4 bag, in the precise angle of her posture. She doesn't know that one patient in one room at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, is about to become the reason everything buried for 6 months has to come back to the surface. She starts the engine and drives home to the small apartment on Albemarle Street, where she'll sleep for 5 hours, and then return to Sacred Heart to clock in for another night shift, and Sterling will still not know her name, and Holbrook will wait in room for 47, and the letter in her pocket will stay folded, and the dog tags will stay hidden, and nothing will be the same after tonight, because that's when the real nightmare begins. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart smells like burnt coffee and industrial fryer oil, the kind of smell that soaks into scrubs and never quite washes out. Katie stands in line at 12:11 p.m., her plate balanced with the careful precision of someone who's learned not to drop things: hospital salad, a roll, water. The fluorescent lights hum their constant mechanical song overhead. She's thinking about Holbrook's chart, about the way his eyes tracked her during morning rounds, about the letter folded in her locker that she shouldn't have kept but did. Then Sterling's voice cracks across the cafeteria like a whip. "Rodriguez, right?" She turns. He's standing 3 feet behind her, his white coat pristine, his hands in his pockets. His residents cluster behind him like remora fish. The room doesn't go quiet exactly, but Katie feels the attention shift the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She's learned to recognize when a predator is hunting. "Yes, doctor," she says. "Where'd you train?" "Some community college correspondence course." His smile is all teeth. The residents laugh on cue. Katie sets her tray down on the counter with the same care she'd used disarming explosives. One measured breath. "North Carolina State. BSN." Sterling's smile doesn't falter. "Adorable. And what was your GPA, Rodriguez?" 3.2. 3.3. 3.8, doctor." His jaw tightens for exactly 1/10 of a second. "Well, we can't all be good at everything, can we?" He turns to his residents, already dismissing her, already winning. Katie feels a tear forming, not from fear, not from hurt, but from the sheer exhaustion of being invisible and then suddenly, brutally visible. She reaches up and wipes it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a rifle sight. Sterling notices. His pupils dilate. Predators always do when they sense resistance. But he's already turning away, already moving on to his next audience, his next performance. She doesn't eat. She leaves her tray on the counter and walks back to the nurse's station. That evening, during shift change, Sterling corners her in the hallway outside the medication room. The fluorescent light above them flickers like it's dying. He's alone now, which somehow feels more dangerous than the cafeteria ambush. "You corrected my dosage calculation in front of an intern last month." His voice is low, controlled. The voice of someone used to absolute obedience. "Do you know what that's called?" "Insubordination." Katie's hands are sorting medication cups, her movements precise and economical. She's done this 10,000 times. Her voice comes out like still water, undisturbed on the surface but with current underneath. "I called it patient safety, doctor." "That's because you don't understand hierarchy." He steps closer. Close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like bottled entitlement. "In a hospital, I'm the expert. You follow orders. You don't question. You certainly don't correct. Do you understand?" Katie sets down the last cup. Turns to face him. Her eyes are level with his throat. "I understand that a 40-milligram dose on a 6-year-old with stage 4 kidney disease would have caused respiratory depression and possible arrest. I understand that the attending pharmacist agreed with me. I understand that the patient went home on the right dose." Sterling's face goes tight. He steps back. "You're on night shift rotation for the next month. I'm pulling you from day assignments. I don't want to see you in my department during hours when I'm making decisions." It's not a request. It's a punishment. It's him reminding her that he controls the schedule, the assignments, the visibility, the path forward. "We clear." "Clear, doctor." He leaves. She stands alone in the medication room with her hands shaking. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. It's the feeling of holding yourself together when part of you wants to tell him exactly what she's cleaned up, exactly what she's survived, exactly what she could do to him without leaving a mark. She steadies her breathing. Night shift rotation. That's fine. That's what she does anyway. But when Katie reaches her locker at the end of her shift, 3:14 a.m., the hospital down to skeleton crew, just the sound of ventilators and monitors and the occasional page, she finds her schedule taped to the inside of the door. Her handwriting didn't put it there. Her name is next to 7 consecutive overnight shifts starting tomorrow. Before she had a chance to even clock out. Before Sterling could have possibly communicated it through official channels. Which means he'd done it himself. Which means he had access to the staffing system. Which means his reach inside Sacred Heart goes deeper than she'd calculated. She takes the schedule down. Looks at it. 7 shifts. 14 days straight of nights. Maximum exhaustion. Minimum interaction. Maximum opportunity for him to engineer a mistake, a lapse, a reason to push her out the door and watch her go. Katie folds the schedule once. Twice. The dog tags hanging on her rearview mirror in her car feel heavier than they did 6 months ago, even though she hasn't touched them. She touches them now, just for a second, just her fingertips against the worn metal. 2 sets of tags. Holbrook's from years ago. Miguel's from always. From before he was gone. From before she disappeared. She changes out of her scrubs in the locker room. The fluorescent lights buzz their constant song. No one else is in the hospital except for Holbrook, sleeping in room for 47 with monitors watching over him, and the skeleton crew, and Sterling, somewhere in this building, confident that he's broken something in her. That is one. Katie doesn't know that 139 minutes from now, Holbrook's heart is going to fail. She doesn't know that Sterling won't answer his pages. She doesn't know that the on-call resident will freeze. She doesn't know that the next decision she makes will come at a cost that no amount of invisibility can hide. Right now, she just drives home through empty Raleigh streets at 4 a.m., past closed restaurants and dark office buildings, with the dog tag swinging on her mirror and the schedule crumpled in her passenger seat, and she thinks about the letter she shouldn't have kept, and the promise she made in Baghdad before everything got classified and buried, and the reason Sterling can push her around is the same reason she can never push back. Not yet. Not without surfacing. Not without losing the grave she's been standing at for 6 months. She makes it home. She sleeps for exactly 4 hours. At 8 a.m. her phone alarm goes off. At 9 a.m. she's back at Sacred Heart, clocking in for the overnight rotation, wearing the same invisibility she's been wearing since her official death. And somewhere in that hospital, James Holbrook is in room for 47, still waiting, still holding secrets in his paralyzed body that only she understands. The real nightmare is about to begin. The monitor's alarm shrieked at 2:17 a.m. Code blue, room for 47. Cardiac tamponade deteriorating. Blood pressure 62/34 and dropping like a stone down a well. Katie was already moving before the intercom finished crackling. Night shift meant the ER was hers, 3 nurses covering 18 beds, and 2 of them were pinned down with a trauma admission in Trauma Bay 2. She hit the stairwell at a run, her shoes echoing against concrete, up 2 flights, muscle memory taking over. 3rd floor. East wing. Room for 47. James Holbrook's room was chaos wearing a fluorescent halo. The on-call resident, a young doctor named Patel who'd rotated through Sacred Heart for exactly 9 weeks, stood frozen beside the bed with both hands gripping the 4-pole like it was the only solid thing in a sinking world. His face had gone the color of old antiseptic. The monitor was screaming. Oxygen sat dropping, 78, 71, 64. Holbrook's chest heaved against the restraint of his own paralysis, lungs trying to do a job his body couldn't help with. Katie's eyes locked on the fluid-filled bulge of Holbrook's neck veins. Jugular venous distension. Classic. The pericardium was filling with blood, compressing the heart, strangling it from the inside. Tamponade. The heart couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't save itself. In field hospitals, Katie had seen this kill men in under 3 minutes. Dr. Patel. Her voice was steel. "Step back. We need to call Sterling. The attending is." Sterling's unreachable. She didn't know this for certain, but she knew Sterling well enough. 2:17 a.m. on a Saturday night. Sterling was either at home drinking bourbon or at some country club with people whose phone calls he'd answer. Not this one. 02 sat 58. Dropping. Katie was already moving, already grabbing the emergency kit from the crash cart, already feeling the weight of what came next settle into her chest like a lead apron. The needle was in her hand, 14-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach the pericardial sac. She'd done this procedure in Sanjin Valley with mortar fire close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. She'd done it in a FOB without anesthesia, with nothing but adrenaline and the certainty that her hands were the only thing standing between a man and a shallow grave. But those were decisions made in countries where documentation didn't exist, where the rules were written in blood and necessity, where nobody asked credentials because the alternative was death. This was Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, a place where procedure was scripture and a nurse had a lane, and that lane did not include cardiac interventions. Katie chose the lane that kept Holbrook alive. "Patel, I need you to monitor the monitor." Not a request. An order. Her voice had dropped an octave without permission, muscle memory from a lifetime of command bleeding through the disguise of scrubs. Patel heard it. His face shifted from frozen to compliant, and he nodded. Katie's hands moved like machinery as she prepped the site, betadine swab across the xiphoid process, draping the field, finding the space between ribs. Pain is data. She'd learned that 15 years ago in a place that didn't exist anymore, from people whose names were classified. The needle goes into the pericardial space at a 45-degree angle, aimed toward the left shoulder, sliding between the ribs at the 5th intercostal space with the same careful precision she'd used to thread for lines into the basilic veins of dying seals. The needle slid home. "I'm in," she breathed. The syringe pulled back and dark blood filled it like water from a wound that wouldn't stop. The hiss of air escaping, that specific sound of pressure being released, of a system desperate for relief getting it. Holbrook's chest dropped slightly. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Again. 02 climbing. 64, 72. 81, 88. Heart rate normalizing. Blood pressure rising, 68. 75, 82. Systolic pushing toward normal like a man gasping for air finally finding oxygen. Katie held the needle steady, letting gravity and negative pressure do the work. 20 seconds. 30. The pericardial fluid that had been crushing Holbrook's heart was now living in a sterile container, and his heart was beating again, actually beating, the rhythm smoothing from chaotic fibrillation to sinus, that perfect electrical cadence of an organ remembering how to live. "He's stable," Patel whispered. Amazement in his voice. The kind of amazement a young doctor feels when the impossible becomes the present tense. Katie stepped back from the bed, her hand still steady but her mind already calculating the cost of this. The procedure was done. Holbrook was breathing. His vitals were normalizing toward the range where human bodies continued existing. And then his eyes focused. Paralyzed from the neck down, James Holbrook couldn't move. Couldn't speak clearly, the ventilator made speech a fractured thing. But his eyes could move, and they locked onto Katie's with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. His mouth worked against the ventilator tube, and he made a sound, not quite a word, more a breath shaped with conscious intention. Reaper. 2 syllables. Her call sign. The name she'd used in briefing rooms and on radio nets, the name that had been erased from every database when the Baghdad extraction went sideways, when 17 hostages came home and 2 senators' children and a captain named David Rodriguez didn't, when Katie herself was ordered to disappear and she had obeyed because obedience was the only thing keeping her out of a federal prison for black ops actions that would never be declassified. Holbrook's eyes were tears now. Recognition. Gratitude. The weight of secrets passing between 2 people who understood what they'd both sacrificed. Katie's jaw tightened. One muscle-controlled breath. Then she stepped back from the bed, peeling off gloves, moving with the mechanical precision of someone running on protocol instead of emotion, because emotion would break her and she could not afford to break, not here, not in a hospital where every second was being witnessed. "Stabilize him," she said to Patel. Her voice had flattened. "Professional. Hollow. Get him to ICU. Run a post-procedure chest X-ray, EKG. Notify Sterling when he's reachable. You're the most incredible." "I'm a nurse, Patel. I just stayed in my lane." It was a lie that tasted like copper. She'd gone so far outside her lane that there was no lane anymore. She'd performed a surgical procedure on a paralyzed former military commander in the middle of the night in a hospital where that action was a firing offense, wearing professional clothes. She'd saved his life. And in doing so, she'd revealed something that couldn't be UN revealed, that her hands had precision beyond what any night shift nurse at Sacred Heart could possess. That her knowledge went too deep. That there was a person underneath the invisibility, and that person had skills that would require explaining. Katie walked out of room for 47 and her hands had stopped shaking by the time she reached the nurse's station. That was another skill, compartmentalize Anne. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the weight of knowing that she'd just changed the trajectory of her own erasure. By 7 a.m., Dr. Marcus Sterling had made 3 phone calls. The first was to the board president at Pinehurst Country Club, reached mid-fairway on the back 9. Liability issue with one of the nursing staff. She performed a procedure she's not qualified for. Cardiac intervention. No physician supervision. We need to move fast on this. The second was to Katie's previous hospital in Virginia, where he had a colleague who owed him a favor. A colleague who would remember that Katie had left suddenly, with no notice, with a letter of resignation dated the day after the Baghdad extraction that had gone sideways. By noon, HR investigator Diane Chen was sitting in Sterling's office with Katie's personnel files splayed across the mahogany desk like evidence at a crime scene. Every document Katie had filed at Sacred Heart. Every shift she'd worked. Every patient interaction. Looking for the violation. Sterling had handed it to her like a gift, a nurse performing pericardiocentesis without physician authorization, a procedure that fell cleanly into the practicing medicine without a license category. It was noon when Katie was summoned to Sterling's office. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid. Sterling sat behind his desk, his suit pressed hard enough to cut. Chen sat beside him, pen poised over a legal pad, already transcribing. There was a photograph on Sterling's desk, him receiving an award from the hospital board, his hand raised in acknowledgement, his smile the smile of a man who had never lost a power struggle in his life. "You performed a pericardiocentesis at 2:17 this morning," Sterling said. Not a question. A statement of fact, a charge, an execution warrant with a pen waiting for her signature. Holbrook was in tamponade. Vitals were crashing. "You're a nurse, Rodriguez. Not a cardiologist. Not even a resident." Katie's mouth opened. She had the explanation ready, the 17 hostages, the senator's children, the classified extraction from Baghdad, the fact that she'd done this procedure under fire conditions that would have made Sterling's hands shake off his wrists. She had the right to explain that she wasn't just a nurse, that she had training encoded in muscle and memory and bone, that staying silent was costing her everything but speaking would cost her more. Sterling leaned back in his chair. "Nothing to say? Then here's how this goes, you're suspended pending review. HR will file a formal complaint with the board. Practicing beyond scope of practice. You're done, sweetheart." Diane Chen slid a folder across the desk. "Suspension paperwork. Effective immediately. Katie's access card would be deactivated. She was not to return to the hospital pending the outcome of the investigation." Katie signed the paperwork with a pen that Sterling held out like an offered blade. Her handwriting was steady. Professional. The signature of a woman who was still invisible, still erased, still following the orders that had been given to her years ago in a place that didn't officially exist. She stood. "Holbrook would be dead without that procedure," she said quietly. Sterling smiled. The smile of victory. You're a nurse, Rodriguez. That's the only place. Know your place. Katie walked out of Sterling's office and the hallway had never felt longer, the fluorescent lights never hummed louder, the distance between the administrative wing and the stairwell never stretched so far. By the time she reached the parking lot, the suspension paperwork was in her pocket and her entire world had become a photograph in a locker she couldn't access. The golf course at Pinehurst was pristine at 7 in the morning, the fairway wet with dew, the kind of silence that only comes before the real world wakes. Dr. Marcus Sterling stood on the fifth tee, adjusting his grip on a titanium driver, his phone already pressed to his ear before the ball left the club face. The man on the other end was Hospital Board President Richard Bancroft, still in his car on the drive to the office, and Sterling's voice carried that particular tone of urgency mixed with concern that made powerful men lean in. "Richard, I need to talk to you about a serious incident at Sacred Heart." A nurse, Katie Rodriguez, night shift, performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a patient at 2 a.m. without physician oversight. Pericardiocentesis. She has no credentials for that. Sterling paused, letting the gravity settle. I contained it, but the liability exposure is significant. The board should know before legal gets involved. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. Sterling watched his ball arc across the morning sky, tracking its descent like he was tracking the trajectory of Katie's career. Bancroft's voice came back measured, concerned. Did the patient survive? That's not the point, Richard. Protocol exists for a reason. She's a registered nurse, not a surgical specialist. We need to make an example, or we'll have every nurse in the hospital thinking they can make judgment calls in critical situations. The ball landed 240 yards downrange. By 8:44 a.m., Sterling was making his second call from his office at Sacred Heart, this one to St. Catherine's Medical Center in Wilmington, where Katie had worked before Raleigh. The reference coordinator there, a woman named Patricia Hayes, was confused at first. No one called for unscheduled references, especially not surgeons calling personally. Sterling's voice was conversational, almost sympathetic. "Patricia, I'm calling about Katie Rodriguez. She listed you as a reference for her role here at Sacred Heart. I'm conducting a personnel review, and I wondered if you'd observed any instances of her overstepping her scope of practice. Any patterns of insubordination, particularly around physician authority." Patricia hesitated. Katie had been exemplary at St. Catherine's, had actually trained 3 newer nurses, had never caused a whisper of trouble. "No, Dr. Sterling. Katie was one of our best nurses. Very respectful, always followed protocol." But Sterling's voice carried undertones of a man who knew something Patricia didn't. "I appreciate that. Just between us, sometimes these things come out slowly. Has she ever seemed reluctant to follow a physician's direction? Ever questioned medical judgment?" "No. Nothing like that." "Well, thank you for your time. Confidentiality, of course. This is still under investigation." He hung up before she could ask questions, leaving Patricia sitting at her desk with a knot in her stomach and the uncomfortable realization that she'd just participated in something that felt exactly like character assassination. By 9:15 a.m., Sterling had made 3 more calls to contacts at Johns Hopkins, Mercy General in Charlotte, and a regional nursing board administrator. Each call was slightly different, each one fishing for something, a rumor, a complaint, a pattern, that he could weave into a narrative of a nurse who thought she was smarter than protocol, who believed the rules didn't apply to her. The administrator at the nursing board was particularly valuable. Sterling presented himself as a concerned physician trying to understand her background, and by the end of the conversation, had planted a seed of doubt about whether anyone had truly vetted Rodriguez's credentials. At 9:42 a.m., an HR investigator named Martin Celeste arrived at Sacred Heart with a folder and a face that suggested he took this sort of thing seriously. Sterling had called in a favor from a friend whose law firm did contract work for the hospital, and Celeste had materialized within 4 hours, ready to conduct what he called a thorough personnel review. Sterling had already prepared a timeline of events, already had written notes documenting Katie's unauthorized procedure, already had the pericardiocentesis labeled as practicing medicine without a license. Martin Celeste spent the morning in the records room, pulling Katie's personnel file, her certifications, her training documentation. He found exactly what Sterling had told him to look for: no formal surgical training listed, no advanced procedure certifications, no documentation of physician-supervised practice in any emergency surgical techniques. What Celeste didn't know, what Sterling had carefully not mentioned, was that Katie's entire background before Sacred Heart was classified. That the military certifications that would explain her surgical competence didn't exist in any civilian database. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had been trained in field surgical response by the best trauma surgeons in the Naval Medical Corps, had performed emergency procedures on teammates in combat conditions, had hands-on experience that no civilian credential could measure. But those certifications existed in a vault at the Pentagon, not in the St. Catherine's records that Celeste was reviewing. By 10:11 a.m., Celeste had documented 17 separate items in Katie's file that he deemed potentially problematic: vague entries about her background, gaps in employment history that were actually classified deployments, a lack of the kind of detailed training records that most civilian nurses accumulated over years of standard hospital work. Each gap, each blank space, was precisely what Sterling had designed the system to exploit. At 11:15 a.m., Katie was called to Sterling's office. She walked down the hallway with a calm that felt like holding her breath underwater, composed on the surface, alert below. Sterling sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled, and Martin Celeste occupied the chair beside him with a manila folder and the expression of a man delivering bad news he'd been paid to find. "Katie, we've conducted a preliminary investigation into the events of last night," Sterling began, and his voice carried the fake sympathy of a knife wrapped in velvet. "Specifically, your unauthorized performance of a surgical procedure on a patient under your care. With respect, sir, that patient was coding. There was no physician present." Sterling's voice cut across hers like glass. "You're a registered nurse, Rodriguez. That means you follow protocols established by licensed physicians. Not improvise them. Not decide on your own that you know better." Katie's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that a careful observer would have noticed it. She didn't look away. "The investigation has identified significant gaps in your training history," Celeste said, opening the folder. "Vague employment records, unexplained gaps in your work history between 2015 and 2019, and no formal documentation of surgical procedure training. And yet you performed an emergency thoracic procedure with apparent confidence. That suggests either that you've misrepresented your qualifications to this institution, or that you've been performing procedures outside your scope of practice on patients for months without documentation." "The patient survives because of what I did," Katie said quietly. "The patient survives despite gross negligence." Sterling stood up, his voice rising now, his composure cracking just enough to show the anger beneath. "You're a nurse, Rodriguez, not a surgeon. Know your place. Your suspension is effective immediately, pending a formal review. You're to have no contact with patients, no access to the hospital floor, and no communication with staff regarding this matter. Your credentials are being reviewed by the state board." Katie opened her mouth and Sterling's hand slashed the air between them. "I'm not finished. Your badge access will be terminated by end of business today. Security will escort you from the premises. You're not to return until and unless this investigation concludes in your favor, which based on these gaps in your record, seems unlikely. Do you understand?" The office door was closed and the rain had started by noon, that cold November rain that falls like a punishment. Katie sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, not moving, just breathing, just letting the weight of it settle. The suspension paperwork sat on the passenger seat. Her stethoscope was back in her locker, placed there carefully in case they wouldn't let her retrieve it. The letter from Holbrook was still in her pocket, folded against her heart like a talisman that was supposed to protect her but hadn't. She drove to Oak Grove Cemetery without planning the route, her hands guided by muscle memory, the same way she'd guided a needle into a chest cavity at 2 a.m. The cemetery gates were wrought iron, the kind that had been standing for 100 years, and they squeaked slightly when she pushed through. The rain hammered on the hood of her car as she walked, soaking through her jacket, plastering her hair to her forehead. The headstone was granite, simple, the kind that didn't pretend to be more than it was. David Rodriguez. Beloved husband and father. Below that, the dates, the span of a life that had been cut too short by a cancer that no nurse in any hospital could have stopped. Katie knelt in the mud in front of the stone, her jeans immediately darkening with water, her hands pressed flat against the wet earth. I failed again, she whispered. The rain swallowed her words and fed them back to her. I was supposed to honor Miguel's service, supposed to take care of the man who led him. Holbrook was his commanding officer, the one who sent that letter, the one who wrote that Miguel was the best soldier he'd ever served with. You asked me to honor that, David. You asked me before you died, to make sure Miguel's service meant something, that the people he served with were protected. And I failed. The dog tags around her neck caught on the zip of her jacket as she leaned forward. 3 sets of them, now. Hers. Miguel's. And the one she'd somehow earned in a career that officially didn't exist anymore. The rain fell harder, coming down like automatic weapons fire, like mortar rounds, like the sound of a world that had no place for women who'd survived battlefields and now couldn't survive a hospital office. I promised you, she whispered to the headstone. I promised. The rain didn't stop. It just kept falling, soaking through her jacket, filling the cemetery with the sound of water hitting stone, hitting earth, hitting the roof of a car that sat empty in the parking lot because she'd chosen to kneel in the mud instead of sitting dry inside. Somewhere in the rain, Katie's career at Sacred Heart was being formally terminated. Somewhere in an office building in Raleigh, Martin Celeste was writing up his findings. Somewhere in Sterling's mind, he was already planning his next move, the next way to weaponize her silence against her, the next system she was trapped in that would grind her smaller and smaller. But here, at this grave, in the rain that fell on her husband's name, Katie Rodriguez was just a woman who had failed. And that was the worst kind of failure, the kind that had no enemy to fight, no protocol to follow, no enemy to defeat. The termination papers arrived by courier at 6:13 p.m., delivered to her apartment, effective immediately. All credentials revoked. Investigation ongoing. Do not return to Sacred Heart without written clearance from administration. The formal letter from Sterling's office was on hospital letterhead and it was precisely worded and it was the end of something she hadn't realized she'd been building. Thursday came like an interruption. Katie stood in the changing room at Sacred Heart one last time at 3:15 p.m., after calling ahead to arrange access with a human being in security who didn't ask questions. The lockers still smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Her stethoscope sat in the bottom, wrapped in a towel. Her reference books, the ones she'd bought to study for certifications no one could verify. The photograph of Miguel in dress uniform, 23 years old, smiling like someone who believed he was invincible. She was placing the last items in a cardboard box when she heard it, the distinctive sound of military boots on hospital tile. Not the shuffle of security, not the soft steps of medical staff. The precise, measured cadence of someone trained to move with purpose. 1, 2, 3, 4. The hallway had never sounded like a weapon before. A man in his early 30s rounded the corner, his bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Military cut, military posture, military eyes that assessed everything they landed on. He looked at Katie and his expression shifted into something that might have been recognition, might have been confirmation. Nurse Rodriguez. His voice carried an accent that Katie's ear immediately identified as East Coast, probably Virginia, probably someone who'd spent time at Naval Station Norfolk. She nodded once. He took her hand, his grip firm and practiced, the kind of grip that transmitted information the way sound travels through water. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, sir, my father wants to see you. Katie's blood went cold. The room tilted slightly, not from shock but from the sudden reality that she was about to come out of the dark. That the walls of invisibility she'd built so carefully were about to collapse. I can't, she said quietly. I'm suspended. I'm not allowed on the floor. He smiled gently, the kind of smile that suggested he'd already handled the details. I cleared it. Please. Room for 47. Katie set down the box. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She simply picked up Holbrook's letter from where she'd placed it carefully on the locker shelf and followed him toward a door that led back into a life she'd tried to bury. Behind her, the changing room fell silent. The box sat on the bench, half-packed, waiting. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of a reckoning walking down a hallway. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, in a corner of the nurse's station where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. Katie moved through the hallway mechanically, a cardboard box clutched against her chest, her name tag already removed from her scrubs. 6 months of invisibility. 6 months of 12-hour shifts and packed lunches eaten alone in her car. 6 months of being nobody. And in one 2 a.m. moment, she'd become everything she'd been running from. The hospital corridors felt different now, not hostile, but hollow. She'd walked these halls as a phantom, careful not to cast a shadow. Now everyone knew exactly who cast it. The suspended badge sat in the box. The folded uniform that didn't fit her anymore. The letter from Miguel's commanding officer, sealed in an envelope, finally answered. She was placing the last item, a stethoscope that had belonged to David, when she heard footsteps. Not the quick clinical pace of a resident. Not the confident stride of an attending. These boots had a rhythm that made her spine straighten. Male. Military gait. Walking toward her with purpose. She didn't turn around. Not yet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, sir. The voice came from behind her, young but steady. Trained respect in every syllable. My father wants to see you. Katie closed her eyes for one breath. Then she turned. Holbrook's son stood in the hallway, early 30s, same steel grey eyes as his father, same jaw set at the same angle. He extended his hand to her, and she took it. His grip was firm, the grip of someone who understood what rank meant, what it cost, what it demanded of you. Room for 47. She kept her voice level. Yes'm. He didn't let go of her hand. He's been asking for you since dawn. The elevator ride down felt like standing inside a descending coffin. The boy, she couldn't think of him as a man, not with the weight of his father's legacy carved into his features, didn't speak. Didn't need to. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen, pressing against her ribs like atmospheric pressure before a storm. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, the hallway outside ICU stretched in both directions like a choice she'd already made. Holbrook's room was quiet except for the soft beep of monitors, the mechanical whisper of the ventilator cycling air in and out. The paralyzed veteran lay in the bed, his left eye tracking movement. And standing beside him, hands clasped in front of his chest like a surgeon surveying his surgical field, was Dr. Marcus Sterling. He looked satisfied. Smug. The expression of a man who believed he'd just won something that mattered. Ah, Ms. Rodriguez, Sterling said, not turning. Come to say goodbye. Katie said nothing. She moved to Holbrook's bedside, and that's when she saw it, the slight shift in Holbrook's eye. The infinitesimal change in his breathing. His pupils focused. Sharp. Aware. One word escaped his throat, barely audible, a rasp that pulled against the paralysis that held him captive. Reaper. Sterling's expression flickered. Confusion. The first crack in his certainty. Holbrook's son stepped forward and reached into his father's jacket, hanging carefully over the chair beside the bed. His hands moved with deliberate purpose, removing something from the inner lining. A patch. Faded from 8 years in a combat zone, the edges worn soft from 1,000 hands touching it, passing it along, remembering. The Special Operations Command Central insignia, the trident embroidered in thread that had turned gold from sweat and desert sun. The boy held it up where Sterling could see it. Where the room could see it. Where truth finally became unavoidable. The door opened. A man in his 60s, shoulders still carrying the architecture of someone who'd spent 20 years carrying a rifle, stepped through the threshold. His uniform bore the Navy SEAL trident, for times over. His face was carved from decades of command, of decisions that cost lives, of honor that had no price. Behind him, two more operators, younger, standing with the easy stance of warriors who'd learned to wait. Dr. Sterling, the SEAL commander said, his voice like a tank idling in a quiet garage. My name is Commander Hayes. I served with Chief Rodriguez in Baghdad. 2004 through 2011. I'm here to read her file into the record. Sterling's face drained of color. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The first stage of understanding that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. Commander Hayes didn't look at Sterling as he spoke. He looked at Katie. Each word was a weight being set down carefully, precisely, each one carrying the authority of the United States military apparatus behind it. Silver Star, 2006. He paused. The room held its breath. For leading a hostage extraction under sustained fire in Fallujah. 3 operatives wounded. 0 casualties. Katie's jaw tightened. 1 measured breath. Bronze Star with Valor, 2007. Ramadi. Medical intervention during a black op that saved the lives of 4 JSOC operatives. Bronze Star with Valor, 2008. Sanjan Valley. Direct engagement. She carried a wounded commanding officer 2 clicks to extraction under Taliban fire. Sterling was backing toward the door. His hands were shaking. The first sign of the collapse. Bronze Star with Valor, 2009. Helmand Province. Surgical intervention in a forward operating base during a complex attack. She kept 5 soldiers alive who should have died on that table. Hayes lifted his eyes. And a Purple Heart. 2010, IED. Ambush. 63% burns on her right side and legs. She finished the mission before she got on the helicopter. 17 hostages extracted. 2 of them were senators' children. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel. Then a woman stepped from behind the operators, FBI credentials clipped to her jacket, eyes that had seen too many classified files to be surprised by anything anymore. Agent Morrison. The federal liaison that Katie had been afraid to even acknowledge. Dr. Sterling, Agent Morrison said, you suspended Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez for practicing medicine beyond her scope of licensure. She holds a Level 5 medical certification under DOD protocols. Your suspension is null and void as of 0800 this morning. You are suspended pending an investigation into your conduct. Alleged violations include systematic harassment, retaliation against a whistleblower, and conduct unbecoming a medical professional. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it again. The security guard who'd escorted Katie out of the building 3 days ago stepped into the doorway. He held a cardboard box, Sterling's cardboard box now. His possessions. His career reduced to a size that fit in a standard office box. I believe you know the way out, Doctor, the guard said, his voice kind but absolute. Security will escort you to your vehicle. Sterling left. Didn't run. Just walked, small somehow, diminished by the truth in the room the way certain people shrink when the lights finally come on. The security guard followed him, not unkind, just certain. Hayes reached out his hand to Katie, and she took it. His grip was steady as bedrock, familiar from 1,000 missions, 1,000 moments where the only thing between you and death was the person standing next to you. Welcome home, Chief, he said. 6 months. That's how long it took for the investigation to close, for Sterling's medical license to be suspended indefinitely, for the hospital board to meet and apologize for what they'd failed to see. 6 months for the paperwork to clear, for Katie's rank to be officially recognized in the civilian medical system, for her to accept the position as Director of Emergency Medical Services, a role created specifically for her, a place where her combat medicine could finally teach others how to keep people alive. 6 months for the wounds to stop feeling so raw. She was driving down Capitol Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon, autumn light slanting across Raleigh at that angle that made everything look like it was catching fire. She almost missed the strip mall. almost drove right past the folding table set up in front of the insurance office, the hand-printed banner reading SureLife Insurance in letters that were starting to fade. She pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. Dr. Marcus Sterling sat behind the folding table in a wrinkled polo shirt that had never fit him properly, handing out brochures to passers-by who barely glanced at his face. His hands were empty of authority now. His white coat was gone. His credentials suspended indefinitely, his path to reinstatement a labyrinth with no exit. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished not just by circumstance but by the weight of understanding exactly what he'd done and to whom. Katie sat in her car, watching him try to sell insurance to people who would never know he'd once held a scalpel, once held lives in his hands, once thrown a patient chart at the feet of a woman he didn't recognize because his arrogance had made him blind. She thought about stopping. About walking over and saying something that would make him understand the full measure of what he'd lost. About making him feel, for even a moment, what she'd felt when her son didn't come home, what she'd felt when the letter arrived, what she'd felt when Sterling's certainty had almost destroyed the one person who might have understood. Instead, she reached for the dog tags hanging from her rearview mirror. 3 sets. Hers, worn smooth from 14 years of combat. Miguel's, given to her by his father the day before the extraction that changed everything. And Holbrook's, pressed into her palm by a paralyzed man whose hands shook with the effort of holding on to something that mattered, something that proved he'd survived, something that proved he'd been saved by someone the world had tried to erase. She thought about true class, what David used to say late at night, his hand on her scarred shoulder, his voice steady and certain. The difference between being known and being seen. The difference between power and honor. The difference between what you do when the lights are on and what you do when they go out. Katie started her car. She didn't look back at Sterling, at the folding table, at the man who'd tried to disappear her and been disappeared by truth instead. She drove toward Sacred Heart, toward the evening shift, toward Holbrook waiting in physical therapy, his arms regaining movement, his hands learning again what they could hold. She finally let herself smile. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Everything else is just noise. If you've made it this far, you know that sometimes the bravest people in a room are the ones no one's watching. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes who hide in plain sight. Like this video if you'd stand beside someone like Katie. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were?